Well, good morning, and thank you for taking the time to participate in this very important process to select UMB's first Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer and Vice President. I'm Alex Lakowski, Executive Director of Media Relations. President Gerald announced the national search for a Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer in a letter to the campus community last summer. Adding this position is important to me, and this will be a cabinet-level position, he wrote. He went on to write that diversity is one of our core values. We are committed to a culture that is enriched by diversity and inclusion in the broadest sense, its thoughts, actions, and leadership. And we are fortunate to have dedicated staff, faculty, and students and alumni who have worked to positively impact change around diversity, equity, and inclusion at UMB. Now, the CDEIO will be an advisor, a leader, and a catalyst for institutional change. And that's why your participation today is so important. First, with your questions, which we'll get to a little later. Those questions will help everyone understand our candidate a little bit better. And then with your assessment of the candidate. Now, following this program, your computer browser will be directed to a survey conducted by an independent agency. It'll only take a few minutes, and I can't stress enough how important and critical, really, your feedback is to the decision-making process. Our candidate today is Dr. Diane Forbes Berthoud. She served as Assistant Vice Chancellor for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at the University of California, San Diego, where I'm told it's a lot warmer than 14 degrees. Since 2017. Prior to that, she was Director of Practicum at Sixth College, also in San Diego. Her previous positions include lead consultant in a countywide organizational effectiveness and diversity initiative in Montgomery County government here in Maryland, associate professor and chair of the communications department at Trinity Washington University, visiting professor at George Mason University, and a senior fellow at the University of Maryland College Park in leadership and public policy. Dr. Forbes Berthoud earned her PhD and master's degrees from Howard University and her BA from Barry University. In a few moments, she'll make a presentation, following which there will be plenty of time for questions. So each candidate for this position was asked to describe how she would approach her first 6 months at UMB in the inaugural role of CDEIO, and how she sees diversity, equity, and inclusion work evolving in higher education. I want to make it clear up front that although we're recording this program for a limited viewing, we're not recording it for posting. So you are the audience. Please ask your questions using the chat button at the bottom of your screen. Select chat with host. And when it's your turn to ask a question, I'll unmute you. You don't have to do that. All you have to do is speak up. If you want to remain anonymous or you want me to ask your question for any reason, I'm happy to do that. Now, with that out of the way, let's introduce Dr. Diane Forbes Berthoud.
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Lakowski, and good morning, UMB community. Thank you so much for coming on this Friday morning to listen to my thoughts on the Vice President and Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer role. I can't see you all, but I trust that you are well and that you are ready to go as I am. I thank you again, and I'll start, even though Alex has offered some insights, to provide some background on my own experience and my preparation for this role of the Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer and Vice President. So my academic background is in organizational communication and social psychology, and over the last 20+ years, I've worked across multiple institutions, most of which have been academic institutions. Alex just mentioned many of them. And also in Montgomery County government, I had a short time at the US Capitol, which I was pleased to work with employees there on conflict resolution and team building and some other areas while I was finishing my degree and then shortly after. And my experience has been, and the experience that has prepared me for this role, has been in organizational development, assessment, and effectiveness. My teaching and research areas are in the psychodynamics of race, and I'm interested in women's leadership development and overall organizational dynamics and organizational change. So in terms of my academic, my professional background, and my interests, those are they. And in my current role, which I believe is perfectly aligned with this role as Assistant Vice Chancellor for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, the key parts of my portfolio are listed here. The first and the most important part of my portfolio at the moment is in strategic planning and implementation. That is primarily what I do at the university, strategic planning and implementation for faculty, staff, student, EDI. And that involves relationships and building collaborations and programs with faculty, staff, students, alumni, and the community. And institutional effectiveness and assessment is also a critical part of that strategic planning and implementation part of my portfolio. I also work very closely with human resources and staff groups, and I'm a liaison to various staff associations and to the board, and working on leadership development and professional development and career advancement for staff, particularly those who are traditionally marginalized and not moving through the system as well, if you will. So I work closely with human resources on assessment, on development, on program development, understanding climate, as well as developing new tools for change. Community engagement is also a part of my portfolio, and all things faculty, staff, and student EDI are areas that, on behalf of the Vice Chancellor and Chancellor, that I am tasked with dealing with. And to give you an idea of the scope of the institution, UC San Diego has about 20,000 staff, over 40,000 students, including professional and graduate students. That takes us closer to 48,000 students. That's a med school and a pharmacy and those other areas. And so it's pretty comprehensive, which is why we need a whole office with the staff that we have to try to move a lot of the equity, diversity, and inclusion efforts forward. So that's a little bit about my background. I was asked to talk today about my first 6 months at UMB in this role, possibly CDEIO and the VP role, and how I see DEI work evolving in higher education. So let me get right to it. In the first 6 months, what's a priority to me is relationships, relationships, relationships. Understanding who, what, where, why, when, learning what your needs are, listening to the community and understanding how you accomplish the work that you accomplish in EDI and in your specific roles if it's not related to equity, diversity, and inclusion. It is really important for me to pay attention and to understand the networks in those relationships and what's important to the community, so that as we think about building a strategic plan and a cohesive vision around equity, diversity, and inclusion, we can move forward together. Collaboration will also be important for me to understand currently what exists with collaborative efforts. I see amazing work that has been done around training and development and pipeline and mentoring programs, community programs as well, the work of the Diversity Advisory Committee and so many other groups, Umbrella, and so many other initiatives that are there. I'd love to know, where are the collaborations across campus? Where are there areas of support? Where can there be even more growth? And so learning where you all have collaborated with each other and ways in which in this leadership role, if I'm in this role, that I can also work and collaborate with you. The work of equity, diversity, and inclusion is not a solo job. It's not a chief diversity officer saying this is the way. It is really understanding both the principles and the values, sharing those in a leadership role, but bringing everyone into that picture to achieve a cohesive vision and to have outcomes that really will move the institution towards greater excellence. So understanding collaborative relationships and then assessment, very important to me. I would spend some time in the first 6 months reviewing, understanding the landscape. I've seen some things that are publicly available about recruitment and retention, graduation rates, demographics, and presence, and those are very important to understand and see. I would love to spend some more time reviewing that more deeply and understanding if there are other data sources that are not publicly available and other things that I can learn qualitatively about your experience on campus, whether you've been here for a year or 30 years, and what do you see as priorities there? So spending some time examining the data, looking at what we know about staff experience, student experience, faculty experience, what we know about community relationships, if there's any assessment of the success of those programs and the outcomes, as well as learning from the community what their thoughts and ideas are. So all of those things are both what's currently existing, but I would also hope to conduct my own assessments and review of the organization as it exists and listening to people with their concerns, their priorities, and their needs. Leadership is very important. Understanding the general direction of the institution. Of course, working with President Gerald, to whom this position reports, as well as working with the leadership of the institution at the cabinet level, VPs and the deans. I'm pleased to see that they're assistant and associate deans of diversity. And so working with those persons to understand what those priorities have been from the leadership perspective, what they see as the ways in which the institution might go, and working with the leadership also, as well as the full body of the various councils and committees, the senates and so forth, and learning what work has been done. But certainly understanding what the priorities of the president have been and all the various groups and all the leadership groups as part of the whole milieu. So Knowing that, and of course, what's available online, but in conversation, what are the struggles? Where are there gaps, and where are there areas or pain points, if you will, that may need to be improved that collaboratively we can build, and with my leadership and guidance that can be accomplished. People, people, people. It'll be really important overall to learn about the processes with the people, the policies, the structures, the resources that are available on campus, and the kinds of relationships that are really important to continue to cultivate, and the ones that need to be developed. Now, in a little bit more detail, here's a framework that I'd like to apply in these conversations with faculty, with staff, with students, with community, alumni as needed, and other groups that are recommended to me. In order to understand these processes, policy structures, resources, and of course, the people, I would think about starting from the top, if you will. And the top for me is where do we want to go? What are the outcomes? What are the expectations? Thinking about priorities, thinking about barriers and advancements, doing some mapping, and then finally action and implementation. I'll break this down a little bit more. So the first part, in each conversation, in each group meeting, in each relationship building session, I would think about asking about hopes and dreams. What do you hope for University of Maryland, Baltimore? What are your hopes around equity, diversity, and inclusion? And some people might think, this is kind of airy-fairy, I don't know. But I believe that you're working at this institution, I'm working where I am, and we're in the positions and roles that we're in because there's some passion that we have, there's something we believe, there's a hope we have for the institution, there's a hope we have for our communities and for our country, if you want to even go more broadly, for our families. And so starting with the outcomes, all of which in any conversation, whatever comes to me, can be measured. And so is it around experience or climate? Is the outcome something around recruitment and retention? Is it more broad, such as, a place where people can thrive, a place that, we want this institution to be a university that is bias-free of discrimination, where everyone has access and can move forward? What are those kinds of things around equity, diversity, inclusion that you see as important? What's the outcome for you? And what are your expectations for this role? So those are the kinds of questions I might ask at the very beginning. People can go as broad or as narrow as they like. The second tier, the other area, and this is adapted, by the way, from an Aspen Institute theory of change. The second area is to think then about the focus areas, or what you see as priorities. So when I'm speaking with each of the groups and meeting with you all, I'd love to know, what are those, we could say 3 priorities, it could be more. What are the 3 priorities that you would like, or that you see as building blocks, if you will, to get us to that outcome? And listening to each group identify that. The purpose of doing that, and of course, in the building of the relationship, I'm also hoping to listen for, are there areas of synergy? So are we hearing things across those constituency groups, and or are there areas of misalignment where one group might be highlighting a particular area and the other group never mentions that at all as a concern for them? So to understand what is the comprehensive picture, if you will, of the institution, of all parties involved, faculty, staff, students, community, alumni. So what are those building blocks and priority areas? And then for each of those that are identified, what do you see as helping or hindering? What do you see as advancing this particular area? Or what are some of the barriers? We won't be able to move forward without understanding what the challenges are. So I'd love to hear from your perspectives what you see as the challenges or the barriers, and also where are there collaborators, and where can we move things forward? What that helps to begin to establish is a map of the landscape of UMB. What is UMB's picture, if you will, around equity, diversity, and inclusion? So in this stage, I'd be thinking about bringing it together and understanding where there are structures, power relationships, or difficulties, where there are inequities, as well as understanding resistance. And how do those pieces play into or contribute to the supports or the barriers for those focus areas that would then affect our outcomes? And then finally, in the conversations with each of the constituency groups, I'd spend time in those first 6 months asking about the ACAs, what we call the understanding, the ability, the skill and will of the organization, the skill and will of people. What ability do we have to address some of these concerns? What policies are in place? What skills need to be built? What's the organizational capacity? overall for achieving the outcomes that we started with? And what action are we, I say we collectively, willing to take? In my previous institution, something that we worked on was, and I introduced this, I don't know if anybody knows about Dr. Ian Smith, but I remember going to work in DC and listening to a few shows, and he would come on, and he is a physician and also works around diet and health and wellness. And in the conversation, I'd be in my car answering all his questions, talking to myself, but answering him somehow. And he would say, you know, if one thing changes, everything changes. And what he was saying as it related to fitness and health and well-being is, if you decide you're going to get up and start walking, I heard it was 14 degrees this morning, forgive me for using that analogy, but you know, if you decided you want, let's forget the walking. Let's say you decide to do 10 jumping jacks every morning, or, you know, 50 push-ups or something like that. And you did that consistently every morning, every other morning. Or you decided to stop eating sugar. Sorry for those who are sweet tooths like myself. But and if you decided to do that, what he was saying was everything changes in the body, everything changes in the system. If you make a commitment to do one thing, walk a mile a day, read a book, meditate, or the different things that help with health and well-being. From the organizational standpoint, or from an organizational perspective, I've done a similar thing in my current institution at University of California, as we have sought to advance institutional excellence, asking people, what is your one thing? So here's the vision that I've heard from everyone, and I've had similar conversations in my current institution. What's the one thing? And it's not that this person is going to, at their level, necessarily get a $50 million grant and hire 15 new faculty or whatever it is, but they might start a book club about mentoring first-generation students. They might do a program on women in science and engineering. They might bring a special guest speaker. They may not have the financial resources, but they have the personal resources. They know someone who can come to campus and speak on this issue. Or they are going to be watching some podcasts, or listening to some podcasts, or watching some videos on a particular historical or political issue to learn more about equity, diversity, and inclusion. Each of those actions brings about that kind of change. So when we get to the action and implementation stage, it will be more about the people and the collective action of the people and the leadership in this role that I hope to be in a few months, and also our collective work together. So in summary, starting with the conversations around, of course, how are you, tell me about your journey at UMB, but specifically as it gets to EDI and building the relationships, understanding the outcome, what you see as priorities, what are the helps and the hindrances, and what are the areas of resistance and power and strength. And then, thinking about getting down to it now, saying, okay, what can we do together, and mapping that. And this is actually the beginning of the strategic planning process from my perspective. And so as I hit the ground, it's going to be listening, learning, and collective building. So the second part, what I was asked to address, and I could certainly, as you can tell, I'm excited about this. I could go on for hours on this. And if we were in a forum together, I would love to hear your thoughts. And I look forward to pausing and hearing your thoughts about that. The second part is about how I see, equity, diversity, inclusion, EDI evolving. I start here because organizations are embedded in a given context. I am not a physician and I am not a scientist. I am not even going to explain all the pieces that are involved here, but this is the COVID virus, or at least the representation of that. I start there because this was, I think, not so much the beginning, but the continuation of some issues that we have faced in the United States and throughout the globe that have been exposed and exacerbated since COVID, not because of COVID, but since COVID. And what we've also seen as part of the context is that there are disparities across genders, across ethnicity and race. For example, and this is not at all a research talk on this, but it is important to point out that even though whites make up about 60% of the population, they constitute about 45% of the cases. Or African-American/Black populations in the US make up approximately 13%, yet they constitute about a third of the cases. And I'm sure that number has gone up since this a few weeks ago. And we could go through each of those groups. That in this case, men actually constitute more of the cases than women, at least from this data source. This is from the NIH, I believe. I should put the source at the bottom there. And so those were exacerbated. We saw that happening. We're also, and have been, in the midst of a political struggle, not only about COVID and opening businesses back up, but also we faced a number of murders and situations, part of a racial reckoning, as some scholars have called it this past summer, with the murders of Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and many unnamed. This is actually not a new dynamic, it's just now being recorded. And so we've seen a lot of this that has caused a lot of strife. In the midst of it, calls to defund the police. And also, while this is all happening, this, of course, this is not even everything happening, but while this is all going on, I live in a border city. There's a crisis at the border, multiple crises at the borders, and we're thinking about how to solve those kinds of things, all happening in an election year. It seems like the perfect storm, right? And one that has affected Black and brown populations even more, Indigenous populations, women, particularly around caretaking, and multiple populations across economic lines when you think about what has been happening. So as I said, we faced a racial reckoning. We faced this close up and personal, not just in the nation's capital when we saw what we saw recently, but we have continued to struggle as a nation with the history and the roots of inequality and injustice in our country. And we saw this 2 weeks ago in the midst of the election season. So why bring all these things up? Because everything we do in higher education is connected and is also embedded in this context of the health crisis, economic crisis, the social unrest and inequities, the racial tensions and inequities, and the inequities that we also see in higher education. And so for me, when I think about DEI in higher education, I must call on and think about and integrate the ways in which the work that we're doing is situated in this larger sociopolitical context and economic and medical and public health concerns. So there are 5 main things that I think will be happening in DEI or EDI work in higher education that I'm forecasting, some of which we are currently seeing, and I believe more of this will be happening over the next 5 to 10 years. The first is structural and organizational changes will take place, that we will see that DEI will have a different role in institutions, that there will be a greater equity focus in diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'll spend time with each one in a minute. Third, as I mentioned before in the sociopolitical context, race, racism, and anti-racism will take a more central focus in institutional life. And as we talk about race, it will also be impossible to talk about race only without thinking about the other identity components and other dimensions of diversity that necessarily and definitely fundamentally impact who we are, how we relate in the world, and what institutions become. And then finally, I think that there will be a greater prioritization and integration of assessment and accountability. So those are the 5 main areas that I think will be leading us or taking us through DEI, or that we will have to tackle and work on together. So first, structural and organizational changes. What I think will be happening, we're seeing some of that now, and the institutionalization of this position is a part of that. Our position at UC San Diego was instituted about 5 or 6 years ago now. Our office is 6 years old. I've been in that role shortly after the vice chancellor was hired. And what we've seen in institutions, and we're going to see more of this, not just in higher education, but we'll see it in corporate and tech and nonprofits as well. You see the news with Google and all these other places hiring persons to be CDOs. That these roles will move from, and DEI will move from a symbolic or a token role and process to more integration in institutional life. There will be more strategic positioning, and you'll see, as in this role, that it will report to the CEO or report to the chancellor or report to a president of an institution. And that strategic positioning signals to the institution and to the community that we take this seriously, we would like to do more, and we need a leadership role that helps to bring all the activities together and help people to cohere around a common mission. And there will be stronger investment in DEI infrastructure. Offices, staff, resources, thinking about pipeline programs, thinking about affinity groups, also looking at the data more closely, addressing where there are disparities in career advancement and professional development, movement through to tenure, where people stop out of programs, where students are not excelling in the same ways or having the same academic outcomes, where there are disparate achievements, or where there might be a poor experience, and maybe it is about climate. And the stronger investment in DEI says that we will then not only examine these things and name these concerns and problems, but we will now put in the kinds of structures and the strategies and tactics to bring about the change that's needed. So first, I think that there will be significant structural and organizational changes. Unfortunately, it has taken some difficult social dynamics to bring about some of these kinds of things. But we're here now and we are going to make it work. The second is that equity will become a major focus when we talk about DEI. Previously, there was a lot of focus on diversity. 10, 15, 20 years ago, who's in the room, looking at representation, and representation does matter. And we have made some strides in some areas, although there's still more work to be done. Inclusion, same. We're seeing more persons being included in certain decisions, more persons included in certain positions, in certain institutions, in certain programs, from undergrad all the way through to postdoc and in faculty and staff programs. However, there has not been as much focus on equity. And equity is really thinking about what the history and the structural barriers have been for traditionally marginalized populations, for groups that are underserved and underrepresented. Equity is concerned with barriers and disparities, and recognizing them, first of all. So we have to know what it is by looking at the data and working to eliminate or address those disparities and barriers. So to talk about look how many, name the group that we have on a counselor, look how many so-and-so are hired here, is one part of the conversation. But the other part is, what is their level of involvement? How much power do they have? Do they have access to networks? Do they have access to opportunities? Are there supports and resources for our students, for our faculty and our staff from traditionally marginalized groups where there have been structural inequities as it relates to those groups? So it's facing the disparities and barriers head on. And it is examining to what extent do each of those groups have access to all the things that will help them to thrive and to reach their full potential. So then a question that would be a focus in thinking about equitable outcomes is, what is needed to address these persistent barriers and disparities? Asking and answering those questions through collective conversations and establishing the kinds of strategies that will help us to get there. And so no matter who we are, what our backgrounds are, our experiences are, it is that we will have all the opportunity to be sharp like this, right? To achieve and thrive and achieve our full potential. That's what equity is about, considering where people are starting, what their experiences are, what do they need to get where they need to go. And is it around access? Is it something related to success? Is it about being parts of programs? Is it funding? And then moving forward from there. I think the equity conversation is also going to be deepened and complicated by thinking about equity not only as, say, money or supports, but as both a process and an outcome. And this, I mentioned power briefly before, but I'll bring it up again here. It is ensuring that groups that have been excluded or there have not been equal access to opportunities would now have, we would think about the resources, the power, and the position. So for everything that affects their lives, everything that we're planning or creating or putting together, our traditionally marginalized groups are groups that have been historically underserved, a part of the conversation to bring about anything that we're doing at the university with the community or internal to the community. So in the planning stage, we should be asking ourselves and thinking about, do traditionally marginalized groups have the resources, power, and position to bring about the changes? So when we think about women in STEM, both in programs as professional graduate students or faculty or staff, as an example, have we provided women in STEM, engineering, technology, and so forth, the resources, the access to the grants, the opportunity to serve, the power, the position to build programs, create programs, to put things together? As we're creating things for the community, as we dream, I'm a big dreamer. I like to think about what can be. This is just my little graphic for something big and amazing. So whatever that is, there are multiple fields that can be represented here. We see some things about nutrition. We see things here about space. We think about construction and so forth, windmill, etc. Do groups have what they need to plan and create and finally to implement? So at every stage, when we think about equity, I'm thinking about it and encourage us to think about it as process and outcome. And do groups that have been excluded from these opportunities or have not had some of the same ones have the resources, power, and position to move forward? I also think that racism, and anti-racism will become more central in DEI work. We're seeing some of that now. There's a lot of, I want to say, crisis response work that has gone on in the summer. Unfortunately, for some institutions, the season has passed and they're no longer talking about this or not talking about it in the same ways. Others have earnestly leaned in and have looked at Ibram Kendi's work, the books around, So You Want to Talk About Race, and other Kathy Obear's work and other persons' work, who think and talk not only about what race is as a social construct and historical and structural elements of race and how racism works and operates both at the unconscious and conscious levels and the institutional levels, and not just thinking also about saying, well, I'm not a racist, but thinking about what anti-racism work means and really going against the grain. So what I'm seeing coming in the future and what's happening now is there will be more initiatives and programs related to this. The curriculum will change. Work being done around decolonizing syllabi, decolonizing the curriculum so that it's more inclusive of Indigenous populations, persons of color, of Black and Brown communities, Latinx communities, and other communities that have been left out of the conversation, really addressing things like anti-Semitism and other kinds of areas and experiences that have been left out of the curriculum, hidden and or not acknowledged or highlighted in the same kinds of ways. The co-curriculum will also change, leadership and development programs, athletics, all kinds of things dealing with service and understanding different community groups. And people, I hope, will become more curious about why are we here? How did we get here? What are some of the things? So I can imagine that historians and social workers and counselors and ethnic studies professors and American studies professors and scholars and practitioners and enthusiasts, people who want to read, will explore more in these areas. And this will then also bring about, I think, structural institutional changes in hiring, thinking about retention. We'll be looking at climate a little bit more. Why? And in the research, and I saw it in some of the climate studies and surveys on campus, that we see that women, that Black and LGBTQIA populations and persons from some international groups are not having the most positive experience, or they're not feeling as free to talk about some kinds of issues. And so how do they experience the climate, and why is that the case? Staff of color may have unique experiences, and faculty also thinking about retention and recruitment issues. So structural and institutional shifts will begin to happen as we begin to address issues of race, racism, and promote anti-racism. Intersectionality will be a part of this conversation. As diverse as each of us is as individuals across the institution, any of these circles, and I'm sure there are more for each of us, we can think about culture, nationality, or sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, occupational status, region, where you're from. Are you from the South? Are you from the East? Are you from the Midwest? This has quite a bit to do with who we are. But when we think about the historical components and the structural components, we absolutely think about race, gender, ethnicity, culture, some of the areas I mentioned, sexual orientation, and so forth. Those are all elements that, in addition to talking about race, are intersected with our racial or ethnic identity. And this will be also, we've been talking about this for years, and Kimberly Crenshaw has done great work starting this off in the mid-90s. And this work has deepened with the increase of the multiple populations across the United States and in the world. Finally, assessment will take a more central role. How are we doing? What is the state of equity, diversity, and inclusion in the institution in each of the schools? And disaggregating that data by the multiple populations that I just identified and more, ability and disability, veteran status, first generation or not. I mean, on our campus, we've established a first generation faculty group because those who were first generation college students can also mentor first generation undergrad and graduate and postdoc students and so on. And looking at what is the nature of the experience people are having. And so both thinking about assessment and accountability. We won't be able to plan, act, evaluate, and respond without knowing first, where are we? What is the state of the institution? What is the state of the school? Then we can align the strategies and develop the measures and evaluate, well, how are we doing? What did we see there around experience, or how accountable have we been in these ways? So in summary, to recap, what would I do in the first 6 months? People and processes would be a focus, policy structures, looking at the data, spending time understanding relationships on campus, understanding the networks, the priorities. And this is just a framework that I might suggest that I would offer, looking at the outcomes, the priority areas, what helps, what hinders, mapping the organizational landscape so I can understand more about the relationships and stakeholders, and then understanding the skill and the will, the ability, capacity, and actions in the community, and internal and external to UMB. And these are the 5 areas that I just talked about that I believe will help EDI to evolve, structural changes, equity, anti-racism, racism and race, intersectionality, and prioritizing assessment and accountability. And so finally, I leave you with this quote from the great James Baldwin. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed unless it is faced. And with that, I thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Dr. Forbes Berthoud. That was a great and a really thought-provoking presentation. Also provoked a lot of questions, which I want to get to in a moment. But you mentioned Ibram Kendi's work in your presentation, so I want to note for the audience that next month the President's Panel on Politics and Policy is going to feature Ibram Kendi. That's February 17th, so look for that. That's going to be a great program. If you wouldn't mind,
stop sharing.
Stop sharing, yeah, that would be great.
Okay.
So we can see more of you.
All righty.
We'll get right to the questions. Mark Dixon has the first question. Mark, go ahead.
Good morning. Thank you for your presentation. My name is Mark Dixon. I work in the Division of Student Affairs here at UMB. And my question is, how do you see this position increasing the relationship that we have that the university has with our youth and community programs?
Good morning, Mark, and thank you for your question. I'm really excited to see, for example, the Cura Scholars Program and some other programs around tutoring and supports and thinking about getting youth interested in STEM. Not that that's my area or I have a bias, but anytime I see young people getting involved in anything, that would be really wonderful. Okay, so like some of the things I mentioned in the talk and thinking about faculty, staff, and students, I would love to, and community engagement is a part of my portfolio now. It was a part of my previous portfolio in my other role, both at Trinity and in my other UC San Diego role. It would be important for me to, with your guidance, of course, getting to know who the key stakeholders are in the community, what are the hopes and dreams of UMB with interaction with the communities and learning who they are. I don't see our role in higher education as visitors, you know, or with a charitable model or a charity model of we are the great, name the institution, in this case UMB, and we have an answer for you. But I see community engagement as a mutual exchange, one that's mutually beneficial, mutually productive. So listening and learning from their collaborations that I can see with K through 12 institutions, that I can see with youth centers and community centers. I don't know all the ones that are there in Baltimore, but I know in our region, the Boys and Girls Club, and then there's some others that are athletically focused. And I see the programs here at UMB on campus. So meeting and talking to those community partners, exploring relationships with the K through 12 institutions, listening to the stakeholders in those places. And so say it's a school. And then we're thinking about speaking with parents, students themselves, teachers, administrators, community members, all the people who have a hand in a school, for example, or learning more about CURE and the YES program, things like that. Increasing the involvement means that the tenet would be that this is your place too. You know, letting youth see the university, see the college environment, the university environment as a place that belongs to them, and that we belong to them. We belong to the community too. So I see some relationship building possibilities there. I think anytime we can involve athletics, curriculum, co-curriculum, and just that even social part, the lunches and the dinners and the events, that would really help. We have programs on campus, and I would love to see some kinds of things like Golden Key and programs where we provide scholarships to students, but also build a program of service and academics with students starting, I think, as early as 4th grade all the way through. And so relationship building will be key, listening and learning and collaboration, but also working on building mutually beneficial relationships. Thank you for your question, Mark.
Great. I want to give you this anonymous question next. What do you consider the traditionally marginalized groups that you would focus on?
So I would want to look more at the data. What is important, at least from my perspective, and knowing the Baltimore context, is exploring more around race and ethnicity. African-American Black communities, Latinx communities, wherever they are in the population and what their experiences are. In some populations, maybe women are underrepresented, right? And so in STEM, for example, in medicine, in some areas, women are underrepresented, both in student population, faculty population, and also in staff. And I also saw in the student surveys that LGBTQ populations did not feel as included or did not have as positive an experience. So looking at the data first, those were some of the groups, Black and Brown populations, Black Latinx populations. Also, there are, knowing the DC, Maryland area and looking at the data, different cultural groups and some immigrant groups don't feel included in some of what's being done on the campus and are not having as positive an experience. And so wanting to continue to look at the data, is that still the same as the survey from 2018? I know there's going to be a 2020 survey. And are there other areas that need to be explored? And then listening to you all about what your experiences have been as well. Of course, race centers and features quite a bit in the Baltimore region as an urban city, and with the history of Baltimore in that area, and also of the University of Maryland. And so those are some of the groups, and this is looking at the data that I've reviewed so far.
All right, thank you. Let's go to Stephanie Seworth. Stephanie, go ahead.
Hi, so you talked in your presentation about outcomes and expectations. And in the introduction, I thought I heard you say that you had worked with Montgomery County.
Yes.
And in like Baltimore, they have employed the results-based accountability framework, which I really recognized here. I know. So I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on how RBA would look in your vision in identifying those points for turning the curve, especially in thinking about the importance and challenges in creating a truly equitable and inclusive environment, and some of the thoughts that you have on how to adapt and pivot based on those outcomes.
Could you repeat the question one more time, please? I want to make sure I got the parts.
Sure. So going back to, so what are your thoughts on RBA and how that would look in your vision and identifying those points to turn the curve, especially in thinking about the importance and the challenges in creating a truly equitable and inclusive environment, and some of the ways that you might adapt and pivot based on what those outcomes actually are.
Thank you. So, you know, my experience has been in working with large systems and trying to establish an accountability framework. And some of the things that I talked about in this framework here is it's a tremendous challenge because the system that I'm working in, you're looking at with faculty, staff, students, and others. We call ourselves a mini city. It's about 80,000 people. What will be important is listening across the board and then thinking about the 3 to 5 top things that we're seeing emerging in the data. And that's not just a decision I'm going to make. This will be a decision in collaboration with the various councils and committees, of course, working with President Jarrell and senior leadership teams. And your articulation, as in plural, articulation of what those challenges are will be important to me. The adapt and pivot piece and how to address those challenges will be to take what we've heard in the data, qualitatively and quantitatively. And what I've heard repeatedly across higher education in my institution, what I've seen here in the data is there are some challenges around recruiting, not so much getting people to the campus, but in terms of presence in the demographic data, certain ranks and certain levels of both faculty and staff, and also in terms of some programs in the med school and other areas, there could be more racial and gender diversity throughout. And so how do we pivot then? Thinking about pilot programs, pipeline programs, and institutional levers, if you will, that you all in your roles can also help to move. Capacity building is an important piece for me because coming out of a large system, I recognize that I or the vice chancellor for whom I work won't be able to do every single thing. So establishing fellowship programs where we train people or help to develop a cohort of 25 or 30 on how to develop pilot programs or pipeline programs, working with students on areas where maybe we won't have the book club or we won't necessarily be the one to be the speaker, but we can bring speakers into those kinds of things. So the kinds of strategies around building community recruitment, retention, and then I'll speak finally about this, not just doing the things, but then measuring the success of what we've done. So building an accountability process means getting the buy-in and building that community around. We will have a cycle of a year and a half, which is what we have now that I've helped to institute at UC San Diego, accountability meetings where we converse together about the state of EDI in our areas and learn from each other, establish best practices about startup packages, or about a women's mentoring lunch or a junior staff lunch or a junior faculty lunch, or maybe it is working with the Black Staff Association or with the Faculty Senate or the Women of Color or the Faculty of Color or the Student Government Association or the Black Graduate Association. So there's so many areas of thinking about how is EDI looking there, and then having a reporting mechanism formally, as we have a budget process in the institution, have an EDI process of reporting too. So I see multiple parts happening here. I see it as collective. We have to be systematic about it, and I'm hoping to gain that collective commitment to move forward in that way. Thank you.
Yeah, in your presentation, you talked about context, that everything we do has to be taken in context. Even the work we do in DEI has to be seen in the context of the time.
Yes.
And of course, we have been and still are in the throes of the pandemic. So we have this anonymous question. She writes, COVID-19 is going to increase the volume of students with disabilities in higher education. How do you think higher education will need to evolve to accommodate them?
Disability is an important part, ability, important part of the equity, diversity, inclusion conversation. And COVID has already exposed and exacerbated the struggles and challenges there. There will need to be important changes to the physical environment and how we think about that. You know, students are not necessarily, I don't know of all the things you are all doing, but I know that you are mostly virtual. They will be in their virtual environments, as many staff and faculty are. And so in the same ways that we are providing some accommodations for all groups, we have to be thinking about what are, from an equity perspective, definitely, what are the needs and concerns of students, persons with disabilities on our campus. And so making sure online everything is accessible. Do we have closed captioning? Do we have interpreters available for programs, for classes, for any kinds of forums? Kendi is coming in the next few months. How will we make sure that that is accessible to persons with disabilities, students with disabilities in particular? This is, I want to say, a challenge, but when we think about some of the things that are happening in industry, some industries are providing supplements or aids, if you will, both financially and technologically for their staff and their faculty at home. Are we doing something similar for students? You know, are we providing hotspots? Are we providing the interpreters? Are we providing the kinds of things? Maybe even a new device that might be needed. Again, as I said, it might be a financial change, and depending on what the priorities are, we might visit those kinds of things. Thinking about accessibility more deeply, and in the COVID environment, around receiving healthcare as well as being involved in the academic enterprise, if you will, that would be a challenge. But I think some of the technological as well as the physical supports and the additional academic or co-curricular support that might be needed, that could be through advisors or faculty, those kinds of needs need to be identified. And then I know that offices that attend to that of disability or professionals would aid with that work as well.
All right, we've got about 12 minutes left, so we're going to move quickly right ahead. Let's go to Cindy Rice. Good morning, Cindy.
Yes, good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Hi, Dr. Berthoud. Thank you so much for participating in this process. Good morning.
Good morning.
My question is, what do you think your strongest quality is that you will bring to the position?
Great question.
Did you hear me?
Yes, I did. Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, awesome. Thanks for the question, Cindy. Strongest quality, that's a hard one, but I'm going to start on the professional side, and then I'll add some other things after that, because we're never just one thing. If anyone has taken the Gallup Strengths Finder, I have taken that and also taught it to students and community members and others over the last few years. My number one strength is strategic. It has been for the last 5 to 7 years. And of course, look at the role I'm in and look at the job for which I'm applying. So that I am strategic in my thinking, in my process. I am strategic in how I run my family. It's like, here are things that we need to be doing or so on. But also, I'll put in there as well, inclusive. You know, I care a lot about both at the professional and personal level about multiple perspectives. I care about learning. And so I won't be able to do that if I'm in my silo and my own way of thinking about things. So it's part of that inclusion that I bring in the strategy. It is learning from multiple persons from different perspectives. I love working in interdisciplinary contexts. You know, I know that UMB is focused mostly on health and human services. And so working across all of those disciplines, plus I'd love to work with historians and philosophers and persons who can inform what we are doing, so that we can hear from other social scientists and other folks in STEM as well. But strategic, I would say, is one of the most important qualities, and inclusive, which has a lot to do with the relationship building and collaboration. And I think I do quite well at that. And I care very much about inclusion, getting as many people involved in decision making and process. Thank you for that question, Cindy. Hope you could hear that.
Yeah. It's so good. It's often awkward to answer a question like that. Like, what makes you so great? You know, and nobody wants to. No, that was an excellent answer. So, I have samples. Aisha, what's your question?
Good morning.
Good morning.
I manage the workplace mediation service, which is in the Center for Dispute Resolution in our law school. And I heard you mention earlier to expect some structural and institutional shifts. And so I'd like to hear from you specific examples of structural institutional shifts that you have noticed at your current institution that you think are related to the DEI work that you all have been doing. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you so much, Aisha, for that question. Excellent question. So some of those shifts have been in the last year or two, more so in the last year. In addition to the campus having equity, diversity, and inclusion as a priority, we also received a number of suggestions from the community and from our faculty, staff, and students. Structural shifts have been new hires. There have been new diversity deans or assistant deans of diversity. We have hired, we are in the process now of hiring, I'm on that search committee for a new AVC, Assistant Vice Chancellor in Health Sciences, that will specifically focus on health disparities. We have both academic medicine, so we have med school and pharmacy, School of Public Health and so forth, and we also have a hospital system, UC San Diego Health. And so there will actually be two new hires. I forgot to mention the second person. One will be the Assistant Vice Chancellor for Diversity for academic medicine, School of Medicine and Health Sciences broadly. And then UC San Diego Health with a hospital, there will be a new CAO, Chief Academic Officer, focused on health disparities, EDI, as it relates to the hospital setting. And that person will work with Patty Mason, who is the CEO of our hospital system, advising her and advising the executive team, her cabinet, if you will, on equity, diversity, and inclusion issues around how to get the vaccination to more communities of color. This person will work with the community, will work with other physicians, other faith communities to advise her on that, and the same in the med school. Others have been new programs for undergraduate students and graduate students. We are going to be hiring a recruitment and retention coordinator, and we're going to be expanding the Black Resource Center as well as the Razas Resource Centro for graduate mentoring and professional development. So those are some of the shifts around hiring. And then in terms of retention, there are programs for we have a White Allies program, actually that's a shift. And there isn't a new hire for that, but we've established a new program. And so that's been a shift. And we started a new cohort of about 30 faculty and staff. And we also have a student group, and we've brought speakers on campus. So I would say hiring new programs and the pipeline programs also, as well as we put in for a new grant, an AFD grant, Advancing Faculty Diversity. And so our office helped to write a grant. I wrote the initial proposal to go forward. That was accepted with some faculty members. And so we were awarded $500,000 from the Office of the President, and then the Executive Vice Chancellor will match that as well. So $1 million for faculty development and advancing diasporic Black studies in and around social inequities. Some of it will be related to COVID, but it would be more interdisciplinary to build African-American studies. So there are going to be curricular changes as well, because we will offer more of those courses and build out another program, which is called the BSP, the Black Studies Project. So those kinds of programs will influence staff hiring. It will change the curriculum. We'll have more courses related to that, speakers that we're going to bring to campus, and then larger institutional roles, reporting to cabinet members and or having cabinet members as well focus more on those issues. So those are some of the organizational and structural changes.
All right, thank you. I'm going to bring in James Wright. James, are you there?
Yes, can you
go? Yes, go. Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Berthoud. This has been really informative and super exciting. And I think I can speak for folks on too that we are hearing about some of these specific structural examples of structural change you're talking about, which often draw on humanities and social sciences based research and efforts. So I have a quick question for you here.
Yes.
You mentioned humanities and social sciences. It's crucial to doing DEI work on a campus. You mentioned critical race theory, Dr. Crenshaw and others, and many other ongoing scholarly efforts and praxis developing frames and practical applications for this work. How might you draw from this body of research, praxis, to do DEI work at UMB, a health and human services institution with curriculum programs dominated by positivist science-based thinking and worldviews, which has often struggled to adjust to anti-racism, decolonial, and social justice frameworks that are rooted in humanities and social sciences paradigms. So how would you, or how should or might we approach sciences and science or scientific ways of thinking about learning, practice, and justice?
Thank you so much. I appreciate that question because a lot of my life at the University of California has been, in fact, my friends were like, you should just come to the med school and work. I'm over there, I think, half of my work week, or even because that science area is half of our workforce in the School of Medicine and the health system. You know, James, I see this as a complement. I see the social sciences and the humanities as a complement to, a partner with our STEM colleagues and our STEM work. How does the research apply? Well, social sciences, and my background is social psychology and communication, is very much about how people think, process information, their experiences in life, and it is about issues of equity, inequality, injustice. And so if we're thinking about treating a patient, if we're thinking about doing social work in the community, in a home with a particular set of youth or whatever it is, we're also not just treating a thing, a cell, or a module, if you will. We're treating a person. And so the social sciences and humanities, the history of structural racism, the history of the exclusion of and murder of Indigenous peoples, the history of LGBTQIA are all present in that moment of care, whatever that is, or providing service. And so what I see our work as being is both collaborative and holistic. And so when we talk about holistic medicine, or when we think about treating the whole person or caring for the whole person, all the great work that has been done around, a student recommended a book to me just this week called Compassionomics, showing the ways in which showing the ways in which being a caring, compassionate physician and professional in health and human services actually makes the treatment better and helps to heal that person, or helps to bring that person wholeness. And so I think we are in the midst of this shift of not just living in our silos, but working across disciplines to understand why we are where we are. And as I said, it's unfortunate that the crises of last year, the economic, the racial, the triple pandemics, the social and the medical things all coming together, have brought us to this moment. But I think we have to seize this moment and then think through together with our partners in social sciences, in ethnic studies, in American studies, in history, in all those areas that inform work of social services, of all the schools, social work, pharmacy, nursing, and so forth, dentistry, that we bring that to bear, or we're going to be facing another set of crises. And I pray that that's not the case. So, I don't see what I do in social psychology or the work that I've done in organizational communication as separate from the STEM disciplines, or separate from dentistry, nursing, pharmacy, medicine, law, all the areas of the graduate school. I see it as very much connected. And I welcome a conversation that connects. I think there's a course at Harvard, it is about happiness. Their courses now on meditation. Their courses in the business schools since the Bernie Madoff and Martha Stewart issues and so on in the mid-90s going into the early 2000s, and similar firms. That was one of the first times that some business schools integrated courses on ethics, right? So sometimes it is the context that will, if you will, force or bring some of these conversations to the fore. I hope it will not be another crisis, but I do see critical race theory. I do see work around structural inequities and the ways in which populations, with disabilities and other ethnic, international immigrant populations and gender populations have been excluded. This is very important. in the work that's being done at UMB. And so I look forward to marrying that and bringing that together and integrating that and finding partners and allies who are willing to collaborate with me on that work. Thank you for that question, James.